So, Vidhya, welcome to the Islam Unraveled podcast and webinar, our anti-racist kind of discussions we have with leaders, at least across Canada, but now you're our first international guest, and really just admire the work that yourself and Moonshot has done since 2015, and very innovative approaches, like very compelling. Even this, maybe before we go into the redirect and the technological innovations you've developed, let's talk about you and your background and your personal journey that led you to Moonshot as a starting point.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me, Tarek. It's great to get a chance to speak to you. And yeah, my background and my journey into this field came probably about 12 years ago. I had always worked on issues related to diverse societies, anti-racism issues, migrant rights. And increasingly, I started to feel, around 12 years ago, I started to feel this frustration, because I knew if I was going to be dealing with racist movements, if I was going to be dealing with prevention and countering far-right extremism, I started to feel this urgency that I needed to actually interact with people in these movements. I didn't understand what would actually push someone to join a hate group and how someone could end up in that worldview. So I took a page out of my own kind of educational background. I had studied anthropology and had spent time learning about fieldwork methods and how you go around doing life history interviews and kind of embedding yourselves with cultures that you want to understand. And I thought, well, can I do this with white nationalist movements? So I spent 2 years on a mission, really, to meet with people in white nationalist movements, to understand their own life journeys, to do life history interviews with them, and to understand the pathways into this sort of worldview and mindset. And it was a really bizarre and strange and very challenging experience, doing that, especially as a woman of color. But for me, it was really transformative in terms of my understanding of what we can actually do to get people out of these sorts of ideologies. For me, it kind of showed me a little bit about the human stories which underpin these sorts of movements. And as I started to understand better the life journeys which took people into white nationalist ideologies, I started to more clearly see and understand, well, how could we actually intervene? How could we actually get someone out of this mindset if this has been their journey in?
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and myself as well, being of Pakistani and Indian origin, although born and raised in Canada, to one, look at our own cultural identity and our ethnic identity, but also our identity as Americans or Canadians. Being raised in Western countries, we are a minority. Whereas if I was raised in Pakistan or India, the majority of people look like us. We're not a minority; we're a majority. So growing up in these societies, we get a sense that, okay, we are different. I grew up in an all-white town called Fort St. John in the north of British Columbia. And so as a result, it kind of informs people's attitudes and biases based on their religion and their background. And so, with white nationalists and how you and I were introduced by Tony McAleer, formerly of Life After Hate, and he's also a neighbor. Actually, we live close in the same neighborhood, and we got connected at one of our Islam Unraveled outreaches at Temple Shalom, which is a synagogue not far from here, where he actually did a racist act of vandalism in the 80s against this synagogue. And so I was invited there by the rabbi of the temple, and Tony was giving his story about what led him to create this act of vandalism, and he was there to kind of make amends, and so that's how I met Tony. And then we started talking about various things, and they mentioned you and your work, and the more I've read, the more that I've seen on YouTube, I'm amazed, and it's just incredible work that you've been able, and the team you've been able to put together. I understand you have about 50 people on your team so far.
We do, yeah. It's been a journey over the last 5.5 years. So my co-founder Ross and I set up the organization in September of 2015. We started with just the two of us, and we had a vision for what the sector and the field responding to extremism and violence needed. We felt that there was a need for an organization that was equipped to develop technology and to use technology in more innovative ways to actually proactively engage with people that are getting involved in these sorts of activities online. So we set up just the two of us, and then we grew organically over the years. So now 5.5 years in, we have a team of roughly 50 staff and a really diverse set of backgrounds and experiences, which we've brought together. We do, of course, have some developers and software engineers and people with that kind of technical background, but we also have a large portion of the team who have backgrounds completely unrelated to technology, who have spent years engaging with deeply vulnerable individuals who are potentially violent. We have a former nurse psychologist on the team. We have folks who have worked in kind of security and counterterrorism for many years. We have human rights activists, people who have been focusing on freedom of speech, and especially as we're dealing with the online space. It's so important for us to have this really diverse set of backgrounds and experiences, which are working to co-design a lot of our methods to interact with these audiences online.
And what you've done, because the philosophy is, it's not just a technological solution, it's a real world solution to really engage with the people that are searching for extremist content online that could potentially be radicalized to violence, whether they're white extremist or Muslim extremist or Hindu nationalist. So there are a number of kind of fronts in which racism is rearing its ugly head. And so in terms of white extremists, as an example, white nationalism, because that is really at least here in the West, this is 72% of domestic terrorism are conducted by people that are right-wing extremists, white nationalists, white supremacists, white separatists. I know there's a number of descriptives. And so in your view, based on what you've learned about movements in North America and Europe, what are the overriding kind of issues like that is motivating these type of behaviors that are going towards violence?
It's a big question, Tarek, because I think had you asked me that question 10 years ago, my answer might be different from what I'm seeing today. We were once living in a context where these kinds of ideologies were really relegated to the fringes. When I started doing work on far-right extremism, I considered myself to be working on fringe movements, on movements which were really small, very tiny groups of individuals that were pushing very violent, very destructive ideologies. They were very much, in most cases, shunned from the mainstream. And that didn't lessen the importance of the work. In fact, a lot of my work was advocating for governments and for the tech companies and other institutions to be taking this seriously. The context has now changed. If we fast forward, 12 years since I entered this space, fast forward to now, I have never seen anything like the context that we're living through today in terms of the scale of this problem, the mainstreaming of this problem in many cases. And I think it's due to a number of reasons. I mean, we've always known that extremist movements of any type thrive in moments of crisis. We know that whether we're talking about white supremacists, whether we're talking about Islamist extremist movements, whatever the movement is, crises are moments where we typically see these kinds of actors grasping to turn fear and anxiety in society into an opportunity for them to grow and for them to break down society as we know it. And I think the last year in particular has seen across the globe multiple concurrent crises that are happening at the same time, each compounding the other, and leading to really high levels of public anxiety. And those moments create a really clear opportunity for extremists to exploit. And white supremacists, white nationalists, far-right extremists, have taken advantage of all of these crises which have taken place over the last year plus. The pandemic is, of course, one of those crises, and it also has really practical implications for how we communicate across North America. Just like you and I are dialing in today over Zoom, there are so many people who are doing all of their face-to-face encounters are now taking place over the internet. We're all, as a society, spending more time online. And we started to track in the early days of the pandemic, we started to track a significant increase in the activity of hate actors and white supremacists across the US, across Canada, across Australia and New Zealand, a range of other countries. So, there was, in addition to there being crises and moments that these groups can kind of grasp and hold on to and try and exploit, we're also in a context where more people are online than ever before. And so we're seeing this really unique moment where the scale of hate online is such that, I in our 5.5 years of running Moonshot, I've never seen anything like this. And it is really scary and very worrying. What's very worrying to me that I've seen in the last 6 months, in particular, the last 6 months to a year, is really this kind of blending and merging of a number of different related but once distinct ideologies and movements, everything from, white nationalists and white supremacists, the kind of neo-Nazi, the old school neo-Nazi movements, to armed groups and patriot movements, all the way through to anti-vax conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxer movements, through to election conspiracists and the wider QAnon movement. All of these movements, which were once separate and distinct, have started to merge, come together, and reach much wider, much more mainstreamed audiences. So that's the main distinction that I'd make between how I'd answer your question had it been 12 or 10 years ago versus today, and just the unique, very worrying context that those of us who are trying to fight this problem are in today.
And with the internet, and I would say, naively, some time ago, I thought racism was going down, but with social media algorithms and to the metrics in which companies are judged is by their quarterly results in terms of users, in terms of interaction times, and so, whether wittingly or unwittingly, social media companies have become complicit in a way to basically content is being served up to individuals based on their interests, and it's become a social dilemma, according to that documentary, in which everyone's worldview is being reinforced by content that supports their kind of worldview. So if it's a white extremism or content that is defamatory against immigrants or Muslims or people of other backgrounds and religions, so that information is going to keep popping up in their YouTube feed, their Facebook feed, to reinforce again their biases, their prejudices, and their racist beliefs. And then where you come in, especially, is to try and stop violence, like countering violent extremism. So there's the kind of larger global hate where people just don't like other races, religion, but they may not necessarily become violent, but they may, in their workplace or as an educator, they may have a bias against people, but they won't necessarily act out in a violent extremist way. But at the funnel in which you're trying to, or you are effectively being able to utilize technology and partnering with technology companies to be able to come up with a unique approach. And I've got to say, what a great strategy, the redirect method. So please describe that, because that is an amazing kind of collaboration that you've done with Google. And please talk about that, how that came to be and the effectiveness of it.
Yeah, happy to. And I might just also start by saying, that the tech companies on their own can and should be doing so much more on this issue. I think we've seen over the last several years a willingness by the tech companies to respond when it came to responses to ISIS or to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. And my perspective on this is that I've just seen over the last several years the systematic underestimation and overlooking of the far-right extremist threat by the tech companies, and being very frank in many cases, an unwillingness to respond. Now, I think that's changing, and I think there's more of a willingness that I've seen in the last year, actually I should say the last 2 years since Christchurch, but then the last year in particular, and then we all saw post the January 6th insurrection in the US, we saw tech companies again taking a moment to take unprecedented action on their platforms. But I think there's a lot more that can be done, and that's not just in the moderation space, the content moderation, content removal space, but also in the proactive intervention space, the positive intervention space. And this is where we've focused a lot of our efforts and our partnerships with the tech companies, is bearing in mind that for nearly any digital platform, there will be some aspects of that platform which are harder to police and harder to moderate. And a good example of this is Google search. You can enter anything you'd like into Google search engine, and more often than not, you'll be presented with exactly what you look for. And it's one of the great beauties of an invention like Google. But for those that are searching for harmful content, for terrorist content, for violent content, it means that it's a very powerful tool for individuals who are accessing this content to be connected with exactly what they're looking for. And so a space like the Google search function, or really a search bar on almost any platform, is a much harder space to moderate, because you can enter anything you'd like into that particular space. So if we recognize for a moment that there will always be some spaces on some platforms that are harder to moderate, and if we also recognize for a moment that in defining any responses to any hate group, there's almost always going to be some content which sits in the gray zone, where it's a little bit harder to say, this is 100% extremist, terrorist, or hate content. There will always be some content that falls in the gray zone. And so we recognized that, and it was one of the reasons why we started very early in our discussions with the tech companies, thinking about not just content moderation and removal, but what are the ways that we can take advantage of these platforms, the way that they're structured, and actually set up a safeguarding mechanism to try and safeguard audiences that are trying to access hate content, to offer safer alternatives, so to connect them in with something that will be safer than consuming violent or incitement to violence content. But then secondly, how can we use these platforms to actually create a useful conduit between someone who's genuinely at risk of violence and a service or content which can try and deter them from taking that path? And ultimately, even can we use these platforms to connect people in with services which in the long run can work with them? So that's what we've been working with Google on, and with a number of other tech companies. And this was where back in 2015, we worked with Google to co-design what's called the redirect method. And the main approach here was that we wanted to safeguard users that were using Google search to try and access extremist, terrorist, hate content. And the way that we decided to do this was actually by repurposing tools which were designed for commercial advertisers. So the same tools that Coca-Cola uses to sell us more soda, or that Adidas uses to sell us more sneakers, those same tools which are used for making brands more money, frankly, we thought, well, actually, can we use and repurpose those same tools to try and save lives and try and safeguard people that are attempting to do violent things online? And so we basically set up advertising campaigns to reach users that were searching for extremist content, and ensure that the very first option which comes up on Google search is a safer alternative to violent or hate content. And I always say there are oftentimes people who are, and there are many folks who are working to do advocacy to push the tech companies to change their algorithms, and that's really important advocacy work that needs to be done. Our main approach here was, until we get to the point where we can actually push Google to change their algorithms and change what content comes up organically when someone searches for violent content or conspiracy theories, this is a simple alternative mechanism to make sure that the very first thing that someone sees is a safer option. And so that's the method that we designed with Google. We've been rolling it out internationally, including in Canada, over the last several years.
Absolutely. And the redirect is, if somebody is searching for that, there's a reason for them to search. And in our kind of personal study of extremists and various people that do these awful shootings at churches, at synagogues, at mosques, a lot of parallels, whether bullying, mental health issues, certain telltale kind of isolation, kind of loners, people that are somehow on the fringes of society. Or do you think that's more of a stereotype of the violent extremists, or have you seen parallels with people that actually eventually do these horrible acts? Have you seen a lot of parallels?
I think one of the, so I oftentimes hear people using the term, especially when we talk about far-right extremists, I hear people using the term lone actors and lone wolves. And I worry sometimes in the use of that terminology that we forget the fact that online communities are very real communities. So if someone organized an act of violence on their own, if they decided to take action on their own in the physical world, and they may have never met someone who's in a white supremacist movement in person, it doesn't actually mean that they're alone if they have an online community that was egging them on, that was supporting them, that was inciting violence and encouraging them to take that act of violence. And so, I think there's sometimes stereotypes of perpetrators of far-right extremists as being, loners, basically, people who are on their own and who, I think there's the use of the term that they're just kind of crazy, that there's something that went wrong with them, they're on their own and they decide to take action. And I think the way that that online communities and online support works for these individuals kind of contests that idea that there's that people are acting on their own or that they're loners in that sense. Online communities are real and provide real support. And this is where, to some degree, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the exact same online mechanisms that get someone into a movement and that might egg someone on towards violence. And we're trying to see, well, can we replicate that in a protective sense? Can we use those same functions online to build communities and pull people back into support communities which can try and counter violence and be a safer alternative to violence?
Absolutely. And we talked about Google, but now the other tech giant, Facebook, and because of the 2016 elections and other countries, they may not necessarily, they just want to incite divisions. So where are the fault lines? Immigration, Islamophobia, Black racism, Black lives, and certain ways to pit people against each other. So create opposing memes and events. So protest this mosque in Houston, and then the Muslims to protest against. So other actors that aren't representing either group, but being manipulated by other sources wanting to create division with existing fault lines, and just kind of putting kerosene on the spark to inflame it more so. And so recently with the farmers' protests in India, certain individuals have criticized the government of India, and they've been met with harsh responses by pro-government people. So you can see there are different, on a global scale, on a nation state scale, to try and affect the internal cohesion of a country by dividing people in a certain way. They may not be racist themselves, but they know this is where we can divide people. This is where we can create enough division so there won't be any focus on their respective countries. Is that a fair statement?
I think one of the challenges for a company like Facebook will be, Facebook has indicated in the last few months, Facebook has indicated a very clear willingness to take action when it came to, the post-January 6th insurrection, removing QAnon accounts, removing even account access, to the President of the United States. Now, that was it sent a very clear message in terms of what's, now to be considered allowable in a United States context for American audiences using Facebook. I think the real challenge for Facebook is going to be, well, how does this evenly apply across geographies? And how do we take the community safety standards, which Facebook holds itself to, and apply them in countries with similarly politicized, violent contexts? And I think, India is a really interesting example where, with Hindu nationalist extremist movements, and with the real possibility and evidence around how nationalist politics can ultimately incite violence, and can spiral outwards in terms of the spread of conspiracy theories and lead to real violence on the ground. I think there is a real reckoning which needs to happen within Facebook around how to apply the community standards that they've held themselves to and apply them across geographies. And this is where I'll say, these community safety standards were written many years ago, were applied specifically in the case of ISIS and Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. We're now starting to see, for all the tech companies, those community safety standards start to be applied around far-right extremism. But a lot of that has been done in the context of what far-right extremism looks like in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, white nationalist and European countries, white nationalist or neo-Nazi movements. And we need to start thinking about how these sorts of community safety standards apply in contexts like Buddhist nationalist extremism in a Sri Lankan context or in a Myanmar context, how it applies to Hindu nationalist extremism in an Indian context, and many other countries.
And you brought up even Myanmar and the Buddhist. So Facebook, in that particular case, because they didn't necessarily have the staff to moderate language, and the genocide that happened in Myanmar largely happened through the platform of incitement content that motivated a lot of people in Myanmar and then their actual military to really harm all and kill so many people. So in that particular case, obviously Facebook is saying, oh, well, we're not responsible for genocide, we're not responsible for these things, but people are using that platform to spread fake or insightful content that's motivating to violence. And so on a very big scale, we can see hundreds of thousands of people killed and injured and displaced. And because the message can get out that much faster using Facebook, and content on Facebook, whether it's the New York Times or me putting up something today, the content can look very similar. And from what I've studied to a degree, it seems like authentic and real news doesn't get circulated as much as the most extreme kind of fake content gets spread much more faster. QAnon conspiracy theories are shared much more in the millions and millions than actual real news.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think I think for the tech companies, they have so often waited until it's far too late to take action. Oftentimes I only see strong action come in the aftermath of some horrible, tragic, a tragedy, a moment where lives are lost. We saw this after the Christchurch attack. That it took the Christchurch attack for tech companies to come together and be willing to take a stance and be willing to respond. I've also seen the tech companies wait until they will face legal repercussions or fines as a result of inaction. And so, I think there is a real moment now where the tech companies need to, recognize that we now have more than enough evidence that their platforms are used and abused to spread violent content, to incite violence, and that directly spills over and leads to real world violence. I think we have more than enough evidence across the globe to prove this. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in, I think when an incident takes place in the United States, given that so many of these tech companies were founded in the United States, that sometimes that prompts more action and quicker action than when these sorts of horrific tragedies happen internationally. And that's maybe more of a commentary around how the world works, and around how tech company incentives. But unfortunately, that's the context that I think has unfolded. Now, after the January 6th insurrection, we are starting to see the tech companies take greater action. They're more willing to respond when it comes to far-right movements, to white supremacist movements, QAnon. I really hope that there is a reckoning inside the tech sector right now, which is global in nature, and where they really push themselves to think through, well, how do these same standards apply in non-Western contexts, and in contexts where so many more lives have been lost, and where real action is required.
Absolutely. And would you say, because the executive ranks may have a lack of diversity, from those countries that are readily afflicted, different religions, different races, different backgrounds that may not be represented in the executive ranks of these major tech companies. And as a result, because there's no personal connection to possibly these countries and these faiths and backgrounds, so the priority and immediacy of responding, just because of that. Just to give you an example, we had a meeting with transit police here in British Columbia, and there's been a lot of attacks on Muslim women that wear hijab in particularly. And right off the bat, they said, well, all the police chiefs and senior police executives are all white Caucasian. So they may not necessarily relate to what a Muslim woman in a hijab has to go through, or people of color. And as a result, it's top of mind, not a big priority, because it doesn't affect them directly. And would you say that because now these companies are so big, in some cases their valuation as a company is much more than even countries, that the responsibility on these companies so much that really, because they are global platforms, their technologies are in virtually every country of the world, but the genocide that's happening or happened in Myanmar, what's happening in China with the Uyghur Muslims. So all of these things happening around the world, and a lot of the mobilization of hate and violence is on their platforms. It's great that you're working with Google. It's amazing work now with Facebook and these other organizations. What would you recommend in terms of, because a lot of people are consuming and spending a lot of time on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and a lot of hate is being disseminated on their specific platforms. In respect of that, does Moonshot have aspects of your team working on those specific platforms and different solutions around that?
Yeah, those are really important points. And I think the point about diversity in leadership in this space, it applies not just to the tech companies, but it's very similar to some of the challenges facing governments who are developing their own counterterrorism and counter-extremism policies and protocols. I mean, we've seen the impact of lack of diversity in the counterterrorism space. We've seen highly discriminatory policies, discriminatory implementation of policies take place over the last several decades, whether in the United Kingdom, whether in the US, whether in a range of countries, and that we've seen what can happen when we don't have more diverse voices at the table when we're designing policy measures to deal with terrorism. And so I think some of those same learnings apply very much so to the tech space and to the tech sector. And I think diversity at the executive levels within the tech sector will be really valuable and really helpful in helping these sorts of companies design better solutions and more global solutions. We as Moonshot, we do work with a number of those platforms that you've listed. We work with them not only to get a better understanding of how these different threats are and how these different violent movements are operating on their platforms, but increasingly we are working, and very much so beyond Google, on positive interventions. One of the aspects that we're working specifically with Facebook on is to evaluate their ongoing efforts and quite new efforts to actually off-ramp users that are indicating through their behaviors that they're affiliating with far-right movements or white nationalist or white supremacist movements, to off-ramp them into an exit program, de-radicalization program, which can try and work with them in the longer term. So Facebook partnered with a few different organizations, including Life After Hate in the US, for their initial pilot program, and they asked Moonshot to provide third-party evaluation of this, which we publicly released the findings of that earlier this year. So the report is available for anyone in the public to look up. And I do applaud Facebook for being willing to take part in a third-party evaluation of that, and for us to release the information in the public domain. I think it's a move towards the right direction in terms of transparency and some of their newer initiatives and newer pilot programs to respond to extremism. And it's something that we're now hoping a number of the other tech companies will mirror and will take on, and that Facebook will also grow that same program.
And in terms of the interventions and the real world interventions, so one is the redirect method to redirect content that is an alternative to what the extremist content the searcher is looking for. But the real world interventions, please describe how Moonshot will work towards real world interventions and counseling.
Yeah, so some of this comes from now several decades of learning from practitioners around the world who have been directly interacting with people in white supremacist movements. Some of this learning actually comes first from European organizations in countries like Germany and in Sweden, where since the early 2000s, there have been programs set up to directly intervene with neo-Nazi movements on a one-to-one basis. So there are programs like Exit Germany in Germany, or Exit Sweden in Sweden, that have set up counseling initiatives to basically develop tailored packages to get people out on an individual level, to get people out of neo-Nazi movements. And a lot of those programs have pretty substantial evidence behind them over the last 20 years, and very low recidivism rates. So pretty high success rates and low recidivism. And in addition to that, I also think back to my own experiences directly engaging with white nationalists. And for me, that experience now 12 years ago, it was so clear the power of human connections in getting someone in or getting someone out of those movements. And when Ross and I set up Moonshot, we both knew that we needed to start testing whether these sorts of human connections, the human connections that we know either get people into these movements or can get people out of these movements, well, can we actually create those connections or facilitate those connections using the internet? And we all know from several years ago, when the early stories were emerging of young people traveling to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq, we know a lot of the initial conversations that were pulling people to travel took place online. So if we all agree that the online space is a space where people can be groomed and can be pulled in to take action which they otherwise wouldn't have, which is potentially violent, then I really firmly believe, well, if those human connections can be created online, we can use human connections to pull people towards safer actions and to pull people away from violent activity. So we, at a very early stage of our organization, Moonshot started to test the use of online mechanisms to create that sort of one-to-one engagement. And increasingly, what we're starting to do is take the redirect method, which initially was used to just connect people with static content, with videos, with pre-existing content, which can challenge the narrative or deconstruct the narrative. What we're increasingly starting to do is partner with organizations that can provide that sort of one-to-one engagement with social workers and organizations that have teams of social workers. And what we're trying to do is use that same advertising mechanism to connect audiences that are in need of that sort of intervention directly with someone who can intervene. And the way that we're doing that is, there's a few ways. So one is that we've partnered with organizations like Life After Hate in the US. And what we've done is we've kind of worked to facilitate a connection between online audiences and their service to actually exit white supremacy movements. In other ways, in other programs, what we're trying to do is set up a one-to-one conversation where social workers are proactively reaching out to audience members that need those sorts of interventions and trying to start that conversation. But important for me to caveat here, this is all pilot experimental programming. It will take a few years before we're in a position where we have a strong evidence base that this is something that can have long-term impacts and where we can actually facilitate that connection online to someone with to off-ramp them into an offline program.
Absolutely. And you brought up ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and since 2001, or even possibly before, they did use the internet in different ways to recruit people and have certain narratives that would motivate people that had no physical connection or didn't know extremists, to motivate them to do either something in the West or go physically to countries like Syria. And so in terms of combating the ISIS narrative and how to redirect and more positive content, because the extremist ISIS nihilistic kind of message, it's shocking to me how it resonates with some people. How would big tech, moonshot combat the ISIS extremist narrative, and then redirect would be, people that somehow that message is connecting to get them to a more positive outcome?
Well, a lot of the methods that we're using to respond to neo-Nazi, to white supremacist movements are not dissimilar from the same methods that we're testing and we have been testing to engage with people who are vulnerable or who are getting involved with ISIS support activities online. The same technical tools we're using to reach those audiences. So the redirect method, that was actually a method which we designed initially to reach potential supporters of ISIS, and we've now since then expanded it to reach out to audiences across other ideologies. But in terms of what we reach them with, it's been a similar model that we've taken. In the early days, we focused very much on deconstructing ISIS's narratives, trying to make very clear the falsehoods around how they were, in the early days, the narratives that they were pushing around the caliphate, the myths that they were pushing around the caliphate, and what it would look like if you traveled to Iraq and Syria. So in the early days, we were really trying to provide safer alternatives and deconstruction of a lot of the lies that they were selling. Increasingly, as we started to test new methods, we also started to look at the possibility of that sort of one-to-one engagement. So again, bearing in mind that very similarly in white supremacist movements and also in Islamist extremist or terrorist movements, a lot of the initial contact between someone who's at risk of joining, vulnerable to joining, who's looking for something to become a part of, oftentimes the initial point of contact is just an individual. It's another person. It's someone who has a conversation with them. It's not dissimilar from grooming, from how grooming occurs in other contexts. And we see that across, whether it's neo-Nazis, white supremacists, or whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda inspired groups. So we started to trial test a very similar mechanism of offering that sort of individual intervention, the one-to-one conversation, offering some form of support. Now, again, these are all pilot programs, and we are running those sorts of pilot programs across the world in different contexts, not just in a North American context, to reach audience members who are indicating affiliation or interest in these kinds of movements. But again, they're pilot programs, and it'll probably take some time for us to have a significant evidence base around this sort of method's efficacy.
Absolutely. And now with Moonshot and your focus right now in Europe and North America, the other international locales that your work is in, please, let's talk about outside of the North American Western context and globally in countries around the world where, again, whether it's China or India or the Middle East or what have you, or Africa, please talk about your other work in non-Western contexts.
Yeah, so we We focused very early on designing methods which could be applied in nearly any context, but obviously tweaked and localized and working with local partners on the ground. So Moonshot is an organization based in London, and we've just opened up a Washington, D.C. office. But we are never, when we're engaging with audiences around the world, we are never the front face of the work. It's not Moonshot staff reaching out to audiences that are at risk. We always need to find and partner with local organizations that are actually the ones that are able to have those conversations with people on the ground. And so whether it's in the United States, partnering with organizations like Life After Hate, who have on the ground experience working with people who need to leave these movements, in any new country that we're working in, we will work to find the equivalent partner organizations on the ground that have all the skill sets to interact with someone who's at risk or getting involved or taking a violent path, but who may not have the technical skills or the technical ability to reach those audiences online. And our role in that partnership is we will work with them to get their good work, their existing work, technologically enabled so that they can start to engage with audiences online that are in desperate need of their support. And that's the model that we've taken, whether we're working in countries like Sri Lanka, whether we're working in India, whether we're working in the Middle East and North Africa. We are basically working to provide that technological support to organizations that already are equipped to be having those hard conversations and those tough interactions with people who are potentially violent.
Absolutely. And what I've seen with some of your work, that you even have data down to the postal code, like in terms of searches, like down to so I live in an area which is nearby the University of British Columbia, and that was where majority of these searches, I was shocked that the majority of these kind of negative searches, like killing Muslims or what have you, like that would be from the University of British Columbia postal code, which is shocking to me. And so that's granular detail, going right to, this is kind of right from this city to this postal code. This is the average kind of searches of extremist kind of searches. So that is compelling, and that is real data that needs to, for municipal governments, law enforcement, provincial and the federal government, to really understand this is happening, and there needs to be an allocation of resources and people to address it. So now, long term, because Moonshot, 5.5 years, a lot of progress, a lot of impact, pilot programs for a number of the initiatives. What are the goals long term? Where we are right now, what's been accomplished? I'm sure in the beginning, what's been accomplished, I'm sure a lot of avenues have opened up, but where do you see this next 5, 10, 15, 20 years of Moonshot's work in really meaningfully, hopefully reducing violent extremism?
Well, our starting point, we set up Moonshot really as a passion project of both myself and my co-founder, with me, my personal mission really being in the fight against white supremacy, the fight against neo-Nazism. That was my entry point into this work. It is something that I will always be, that will always be my primary fight. For my co-founder, Ross, he's Irish. He grew up in Ireland. For him, his entry point into this was really a focus on Irish dissident republicanism. And so I should say up front, even neither of us started this by working on a number of other extremisms which exist around the world and which our organization now works on. For us, extremism in any geography, across any ideology, these are all different aspects of different sides of the same coin. And we set up an organization which was really focused on hate and extremism at the heart of its work. Now, over the years, we've started to see that some of the tools and the methodologies that we've designed have application across other forms of online harm. And in the last couple of years alone, we've started to trial test, well, can some of these methods provide value in the fight against human trafficking, or in the fight against child sexual exploitation online, or the fight against gender-based violence online, or domestic violence, intimate partner violence. So over the years, and in particular the last 2 years, we've started to take some of our methods and expand our remit as an organization well beyond just my own personal fight against white supremacy, or the organization's fight against violent extremism, and we've started to expand our mission across online harms. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I think Moonshot is going to, our kind of main ambition is to start to take the same challenges that we took to the counter-extremism sector, and to try and take those same challenges and the same creative piloting of initiatives to other sectors that are dealing with online harms more broadly. And that's where I think, unfortunately, when I mentioned earlier that we're seeing this blending and this metastasization of all these once distinct ideologies, which are now coming together and just creating a mess on the internet. To be frank, it's just a mess of conspiracy theories, disinformation, hate, violence. Where we could once be an organization focused on violent extremism, I don't think it's possible for us anymore. We need to be looking across the spectrum and thinking about online harms much more broadly. And so I have some really ambitious goals for us as an organization in terms of what we want to do, not just in the fight against hate and violent extremism, but in the fight against disinformation, the fight against gender-based violence, the fight against human trafficking, the fight against exploitation, all of these other harms which are facilitated by the internet. I think we have a lot of value to add. So that's where I'm looking next. That's the kind of next horizon that I'm looking at, and which our organization is going to be taking on more frontally.
Absolutely. And human trafficking and domestic violence, gender violence, like sexual orientation violence, it's all, it's the tools can apply in many different ways. And violent extremism, as horrific as it is, but there's almost equal greater harms. And so I'm sure even people with suicidal behaviors, self-harm and these type of things, there could be, again, if somebody's searching for these type of things, again, a redirect, a hopeful kind of message. Now, in terms of the redirect content, how would that redirect content be created, or how would you find it and curate it and say, okay, here's content that could hopefully dispel this narrative of this specific race and religion?
So we don't create any content as Moonshot. We're not a content creation organization. Our main approach here is to identify and then amplify existing content, which has already been created across the globe, created by organizations that are doing this work. And our main aim is to amplify that content with audiences that need to see it. Sometimes that content is really easy to find. Sometimes it's there. It's very clearly been created by organizations, and they just need to get it out to the right audience. Sometimes our work involves finding organizations that we know are the right voices. They're the ones that are doing the work on the ground, but maybe they haven't created digital content yet. Maybe they haven't taken their work into the online space. And so this is where some of the work that we're doing is really just around digital capacity building for organizations that have all the right ingredients, all the right skills, all the right voices which need to be heard, but they just maybe haven't taken their work online and digitized it yet. And so that's where we work with them to help them create content, which is their content. They own it. They are going to use it in the longer term. And then we just create that kind of technical conduit between an online audience and that content. We've developed a number of different tools over the last few years that help us to search for this sort of content, which could be powerful and impactful in front of someone who's at risk. But our teams are sifting through thousands of videos every day to try and find that content. And one of our preferred ways of doing this is to start first with partners that we know are going to be authentic, going to have the right skills and the right voices, and we'll just help them, get the content that they need made.
There's content that I came across on YouTube. You're probably aware of it. Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. I don't know if you're familiar, Emmanuel Acho. And I thought his approach was fantastic, the way he came across. And so he didn't go with a harangue against white people. It was more trying to, his line is, people don't care what you know, they just want to know you care. They want to know you care. And once they know you care, then you can explain to them. But if we're trying to blame and shame and kind of demonize, it's hard to get a message across if it's adversarial. So on that note, because again, racism, religious discrimination, so there's towards the work you're working towards, which is preventing violent extremism, but then there's the globalized uh, racial and religious discrimination, which may not necessarily prompt violence, but it is a bias. Like too hard, people is like they may never do any violent act, or they may never physically harm anyone, or any extremist things, but their belief about a race or religion is such that that just in their family or their social set, they have this biased and prejudiced view. And so part of engagement before it goes full blown to the point where somebody's ready to commit a violent act, the overall engagement between communities that may not connect with one another, Black people and white people, uh, the greater Western community and Muslims in general. And part of our outreach, what we came across with the outreach at churches and synagogues and public forums, the vast majority of people we interacted with said, "Oh, we've never met Muslims before," and as such, they believe everything that they. So, I'll just share with you a few things. That number one, there's a big fear that the Muslims are trying to implement Sharia law in North America, which again, there's never nothing in any Muslim gathering I've ever been to that's ever been brought up. But that is a real fear and a real belief. And so again, these folks may not necessarily do any violent acts, but their hardened prejudice requires some sort of engagement. And as you said, some compassion and empathy. And what you did 10, 12 years ago, going to sit with, white nationalists, not the average person can do that or have that kind of courage or kind of conviction to say, you know what, I should sit down with these folks and have a conversation with them. And I think that in and of itself, breaking bread and having a meaningful conversation with people to really understand them can change people just like that, just by interacting with them. And maybe just in closing, how did your view change? Like, because like sometimes like I kind of meet with people that have racist views, and then I just shocks me. But how did it change you when you met with these groups, and did it change your opinion? Did it increase any empathy? Like, maybe if you could just in closing just talk about that, just to take away how your views changed.
Sure. Yeah. It was the toughest experience of my life having those conversations. It took a lot in me to sit through the events that I sat through and to sit through those conversations. But I learned a lot from the experience, and I think the thing which was most surprising for me was I went into it thinking, these people are monsters. These people are horrible. And how can they even say these things about people that look like me, about immigrants, about, people from my background? And I think what surprised me through my encounters with them was that I started to, I never sympathized with their experiences. I never offered them sympathy in any form. But I started to just understand their journeys. I started to understand how someone who had experienced what they experienced, or who had been through their experiences in their unique context, I started to understand how they had ended up in this particular place at this particular time and with this particular movement. And for me, it is empathy in some form, right? It's not sympathy, and I'm not agreeing with them or sympathizing with their worldview, but I started to have some empathy for how they got there. And for me, that was crucial for me to then grant them the possibility of change. And that, I think, is the most important thing that I learned through that experience, is that change is possible. A lot of the people that I met in the movement were not happy. They weren't happy there. This group wasn't providing them with, every solution in their lives. A lot of them were deeply unhappy people. And that for me offered the opportunity. That's the opportunity for change, for them finding a different path in life that I actually think could be more fulfilling. It's a deeply disturbing way to live your life if you believe that people like me and like you, Tariq, are out to get you, are out to get people. If you believe the lies that they tell about immigrants, about people of color, about Muslims, about Black people, if you actually believe all of those conspiracy theories and those lies, the world is a very scary place. And I started to think about what it would be like to be them, and I started to feel bad for them. I started to feel bad for them because I do not live in this world constantly filled with fear. I don't live my life constantly filled with fear about people that look like me or that look different from me. And I started to feel bad for them. And that for me shifted the power dynamic in some ways, because I started to realize, well, actually you need help. And I think there's a better path for you. So it was a surprising experience, but one thing I would also, just a final point to end with, I don't think that the expectation should be on people that look like me or look like you to go have conversations with people in these movements. I think that's too much to ask of anyone. I think it can be dangerous, and nobody should be putting themselves in harm's way to try and change someone's mind who's racist. But I think this is where technology has the power to take those sorts of interactions, which could be dangerous in a physical setting, and try and create those sort of encounters with someone who's different online. So this is where, I think videos like the video that you mentioned earlier, the conversations with someone who looks a bit different, which already exist online, if we can take those sorts of that sort of content and those sorts of videos out to people who have never had an encounter with someone who is Muslim or Black, or who looks different from them with an immigrant, then I think technology has the power to create those sort of interactions, to provide that kind of cognitive dissonance, which sometimes doesn't exist in someone's everyday world. And that's what we're trying to do with Moonshot. We're trying to use technology to create those kinds of encounters without expecting people like you and me to go have those encounters in our everyday lives with people around us.
Well, I have to say I'm a fan of your work and a fan of you, and really admire the work that you're doing. And it takes a lot of heart to do this work, because changing people's ideas and prejudices, it's not easy. And to make that lasting change, and your combined approach with online and offline, really that is the way that we're going to make change, and even to diversify into the other areas that are as important, because I'm sure all the tool sets and skills and teams that you've developed can apply to all these other important areas. So we're however we can help and support, we're grateful to do so. And I want to thank you, Vidhya and Moonshot and your team, for all the great work you're doing. Thank you for taking your time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.